I put on a jacket for you.
I appreciate that. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Conversations Over Coffee with Bet Tzedek Congregation. I'm Steve Wernick, Reb Steve, one of the rabbis of Bet Tzedek. We're happy to have you all here to participate in this morning's video blog with Dr. Aurel Braun. Dr. Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. He's also a senior member of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and of the Center for International Studies, and a fellow and senator of Trinity College at the University of Toronto. All that is to say that Dr. Braun is an expert on Russia and on the Middle East. Aurel, he's also a member of our congregation, I should say, too, which is perhaps the most coveted position that he has. Aurel, thanks for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Wonderful. And you're managing the pandemic okay?
We're surviving, managing, I'm not sure is the right word, but the vaccines are now coming in, and hopefully that would change the situation.
Amen. Of course, it's a good reminder to people that as our numbers in Canada, in Ontario in particular, and the US and around the world continue to rise, even though the vaccines are coming out, it's still important to practice the public health safety measures. Wear a mask, practice physical distance, wash your hands, and limit your exposure to crowds and large groups of people. Your expertise is in the news again. Let's start with Russia. It seems like there's been a very significant breach of US data, unclassified data. But I read also recently in the Globe and Mail that there are other countries involved, including Israel and Canada and the UK, that seem to have been breached as well. This is not the first time that government officials have pointed the mouse, I suppose, the finger at Russia for this. From your perspective, what's going on? What's motivating Russia at this time to be so aggressive towards Western nations?
It is not this time only. This has been a pattern of behavior on the part of Russia, and has been going on for a long time. So I'm usually surprised if Russia is not trying to do something like this, if Russia is not trying to prod and probe, because this is their modus operandi. And for quite some time now, under Vladimir Putin, Russia has behaved in a very assertive, even in an aggressive fashion. We know that Russia invaded parts of Ukraine. It illegally annexed Crimea, and it did so with considerable violence. And partly, I think this is motivated by the domestic failures within Russia. If you look at Russia, this is a vast country. It stretches over 11 time zones. It has enormous natural wealth, probably more than any other country. It's by far the largest country geographically. It has a very talented population, tremendous scientists who have contributed vital things to a variety of fields. And yet, when you look at Russia's nominal GDP, it's roughly the size of Italy's. Russia has a unidimensional economy. It doesn't export much beyond energy. About 60% of its exports are armaments.
I just want to introduce you. Russia is a unidimensional economy.
Yes. In other words, it's not diversified. Think of it this way. This is supposed to be a highly advanced country. This is the claim made by Moscow. They want to be listened to. They want to be viewed, if not quite as a superpower, almost like a superpower, a unique global power is some of the terms, one of the terms that they have employed. Well, we would expect that they would have a vibrant, influential economy, that they would be engaged in the globalization of the international system. And then consider, do you know anyone who's driving a Russian car? Do you know anyone who's using a Russian computer? Do you know anyone who's taking Russian medicines? So what are the signs of success or of modernity? There are very few. Russia, in fact, is a very poor country. The per capita GDP is very low. So after 20 years in power, what does Vladimir Putin really have to show? Well, what he has to show is that he has claims to international successes, that he has been able to outsmart Obama in the Middle East, that he was able to go in there and play a big role in Syria, that he has been able to annex Crimea, and the West has not been able to reverse that, that he is able to threaten the Baltic states. These external successes, in a sense, are meant to compensate for what are actually massive internal failures to modernize a state that has so much potential, a potential that is not realized.
So it sounds like that Putin's actions are out of the playbook for totalitarian regimes, which is distract from your local circumstance, and look what we're doing, for our national pride, in other arenas. Why do the Russian people? Why does anybody seem to always fall for that?
Well, your political science background is showing, Rabbi, and you're entirely correct. This is a classic diversion. It is used by dictators, by dictatorial regimes, external threats, or external involvement, or external successes, or claims to external successes, are meant to compensate for what is happening domestically. Initially, Putin was more successful domestically because oil prices, energy prices were rising. So even though there's an astonishing amount of corruption in Russia, and some people view Russia as one giant kleptocracy where the oligarchs are grabbing a great deal of the wealth, there was enough of a trickle down that the population could see a steady improvement. And consequently, there was this kind of tacit social contract that you, the people, are going to have a continuous, even if limited, improvement in your standard of living. You are not going to have the kind of chaos that ensued under the rule of Yeltsin, who was committed to democracy, which is did not know how exactly to implement it, and that therefore you, in exchange, will not challenge the leadership politically. What has happened in the past several years, though, is that oil prices, energy prices have not been high. Putin has not been able to deliver that steadily increasing standard of living. And so there have been protests, there have been mass protests, there have been claims of fraudulent elections. The plebiscite that occurred earlier this year was viewed as illegitimate by many of the people. We know that opposition leaders have spoken up and some have died. Yes, just outside the walls of the Kremlin. And in the case of Navalny, he was poisoned. He almost died.
What if you were in the ability to advise the U.S. and Canada in terms of how it should respond to these latest rounds of attacks, but also, as you said, the ongoing threat from Russia? It's picking and prying into U.S. and Canadian and other Western countries' affairs. What advice would you give these leaders?
Well, first, work on the assumption that Russia will try to interfere in elections, in processes everywhere, because it has. It should never have been a surprise that Russia tried to interfere in the 2016 elections. It doesn't mean that they were effective in their intervention, but they interfered in the German elections, in the French elections. This is what they tried to do, try to manipulate. This is how Putin tries to compensate for a lack of economic weight by using political maneuver, intrigue, intimidation, and so on. So be prepared for that. Make sure your cyber defenses are in good shape. Make sure that you are expecting these kind of actions And there will still be intrusion because of the nature of cyber warfare. This is cyber warfare. It's part of what has been called inaccurate as hybrid warfare, but it's bound to happen. The second thing is you need to preserve strong sanctions against Russia because, in a sense, Russia needs to be contained, not because Russia is the Soviet Union, not because Russia is the primary threat to Western democracies. It's not, it's China. It is because Russia may miscalculate, and often wars happen because of miscalculation. So, in a sense, you need to remove temptation. So, you have to have defenses that are capable. The Europeans have not been spending enough money on their own defenses. For decades and decades, United States has been spending more on defending the Europeans than the Europeans do themselves. There's no reason why a very wealthy country like Germany should not be able to spend more on its defenses. Same thing with Italy. Germany is spending about 1.3%. There has been a commitment that by 2024, the NATO states should be spending about 2% of the GDP on defense. Well, Germany is nowhere close to meeting that. Neither is Italy, neither is Canada. So you can't expect the United States, which is spending like 3.6%, to keep taking up the slack. So it's essential. It's essential that we in Canada defend our north, that we have that kind of capability against Russian intrusion.
What would that increased spending according to NATO guidelines? What would it be used on? What would it accomplish?
It also stipulates that a certain amount has to be spent on equipment. You can't work magic. Mm-hmm. That is, you need to have the aircraft. Well, take Canada, for example. We are flying fighter aircraft that are often older than the pilots who are flying them. And instead of making a decision on buying new aircraft, I have for long, I testified before parliamentary committees, we should be buying stealth aircraft. They're the ones that are effective, the F-35s. There's no other aircraft that would do the job. We are dithering with that. We're talking about defending Canadian sovereignty. We're not doing enough. We should be doing more in terms of buying naval equipment. We're supposed to buy some. We should buy icebreakers. The Russians dominate with icebreakers. And as there is some melting in the north, and I'm writing a book on West Russia and Arctic security, they are moving towards opening up the Northern Sea route, which could revolutionize international trade because it would cut off 30% of the cost and 30% of the time of shipping if you could navigate through that area. But you need to have heavy icebreakers. Russia has nuclear-powered icebreakers. We have one old icebreaker, another one is not quite ready. The Americans are building some, but not enough. China is moving in because they want to encourage the development of a maritime Silk Road. So we have to be aware of that. And lastly, what is absolutely crucial to understand is that even though we all want to save the environment, energy is crucial. Nothing has hurt Russia as much, has punished Russia as much as the fact that the United States has become an energy exporter, because that has kept energy prices low, and that has really damaged Russia's economy, and it limits Russia's ability to buy more armaments, to engage in more of these adventures. So that is another crucial factor to keep energy prices low, to diminish dependence on Russian energy because they sell a lot of natural gas to Germany. Germany should not be buying as much natural gas from Russia because with 30%, that creates a lot of dependency to building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That should be abandoned. There's more energy on the market. So those are the kind of things that would be absolutely essential. And then when we look at the Middle East, we also have to look at the negative role that Russia is playing in the Middle East, where it is working together with Turkey, is working together with Iran. And even though relations between, let's say, Vladimir Putin and Israeli leadership are good, overall Russian policy is harmful to the Middle East in general and to Israel in particular.
So let's turn to the Middle East now. That's a good segue. It seems like peace is breaking out between a lot of the Arab Gulf states and Israel, and UEA, Bahrain, Morocco now, and others. Secret meetings apparently in Saudi Arabia between the prince and Netanyahu, the other prince. Why now? Why suddenly does it seem that the many of the Arab countries are aligning themselves with Israel?
If there is a single term, word one could use, that word would be Iran. But it is more than that. I know that a great many people have an intense dislike of Mr. Trump, and he's an unpleasant character. But we have to try to separate the rhetoric, which has been awful, from policy, which has been very, very good. What is happening today is to a significant degree because of the very difficult and assiduous work done by the Trump administration and the new thinking that was done by the Trump administration, which basically said that what is crucial in the Middle East is not merely the Arab-Israeli conflict, but the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What is also crucial is the larger strategic picture, that Arab states are beginning to recognize what a threat Iran is posing, that what happened in Syria is extremely disruptive, that the unhinged ambition of Erdogan in Turkey are highly problematic, and that therefore a lot of these other states, whether it is the Emirates, whether it is Bahrain, whether it is Sudan, whether it is Morocco, which is further away, and eventually Saudi Arabia, they need to join in a realistic policy to counter what has occurred in the Middle East. What occurred in the Middle East by letting Russia in, by allowing the disintegration in Syria and elsewhere under the Obama administration has been nothing short of catastrophic.
So the peace, the peace agreements and the normalization of relationships are designed to counter Iran. What do they do though with regard to the Palestinian issue? Because that still remains an issue. It still is problematic for Israel and certainly problematic for the Palestinians. Does it also potentially open a pathway for the Palestinians and the Israelis to come to some sort of agreement, or is that just something that where the status quo, is going to remain as it is? I certainly think there's an opportunity for the Palestinians to realize that now is another time to get on a positive bandwagon. But looking at Palestinian leadership, Abbas, and not knowing necessarily who's going to come after him, or be worried that whoever comes after him is actually going to be worse. I have to say I'm not optimistic about anything, but I wonder from your perspective as someone who studies this regularly, what your thoughts are on potentials for Palestinian-Israeli agreements at this moment.
At one level, what you see is a recognition of the strategic reality of the region and the strategic reality of the world. But the problem has been, of course, Israel has not been perfect. No democracy is, and there have always been some missteps. But there have been many, many attempts, as you know, Rabbi, at peace agreements. It's not that the Palestinians have not had offers, that they have not had pretty good and viable offers. It has been in the past the case that the Palestinian leadership, which is an utterly corrupt leadership. I mean, Abbas's leadership is terribly corrupt. And then when you look at Hamas, this is a vicious dictatorship. I mean, what Hamas is doing to its own people is absolutely horrific. This is,
and you have to look at Hezbollah too,
and Hezbollah, which is not Palestinian, but it's still threatening Israel. Right. And we can talk about the role of Hezbollah, how dangerous that is, and how that also is one of the many factors. Because when you look at it, sort of like playing three-dimensional chess, there's so many different players and so many different layers. But the Palestinian leadership has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Yeah,
And
Ambassador Abbas, even rather, Ambassador Abba Ibn, who said that.
exactly. And there are opportunities right now, because if there was realism in the case of Palestinian leadership, they could see that this is also an opportunity, that they could get a lot of support from Saudi Arabia and from the Emirates and from Bahrain, financial support, if they would embark on the road to peace. Um, and so the question that the Palestinian leadership has to face right now is, are they more keen on destroying Israel rather than building their own state? And that wouldn't be a perfect state. Israel, had to compromise as well at its foundations. The founding father, so to speak, and well, there was Golda Meir, founding mother of Israel. They understood that they had to deal with that political reality. They accepted the partition plan. They tried every possible way to find peace. Prior to 1967, there were no Israeli troops in Gaza, and there are now, but there were none in the West Bank or Judea, Samaria, and there was no peace. There was an opportunity. I mean, we well remember what the policy of the PLO was before 1967, and the three no's that came afterwards. So, in order to reach an agreement, you have to have all parties really want to move along that road, and that road would involve compromise on the part of Israel, compromise on the part of various other states. But the reality is that the conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Israel is not the central issue in the Middle East.
It shifted
I mean,
to Iran.
it is an important issue,
Yeah.
and would be one that would be tremendous to resolve, but it is not that. And that is a crucial recognition. This is why there's been this kind of movement. But the issues now are Iran and Turkey's play and Russia. And you brought up Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is basically, in key respect, a tool of Iran. It is the western border of Iran facing Israel. And it has become a really powerful force. And they have something like 130,000 rockets or so on that they
Latest
have.
reports I've seen from the IDF are 150,000 rockets, and concern over greater precision guidance systems is what the worry is. Which brings us, in the time remaining, to the JCPOA, which I know I know you're not a fan of, to put it mildly, but even more so. I mean, we all know, seriously, we know that it was a very controversial agreement when it was created under the Obama administration. President Trump, withdrew from it quite dramatically. And now that the Biden administration is getting ready to come in, there's a lot of talk about what happens now with it. Is it possible to renew it? Is it possible to change it? There's a lot of concern that I've been reading about not just Iran's activity with regard to nuclear capability, but even more so with missiles and the precision guidance systems that they have and that they're developing to possibly accompany the delivery system of a nuclear weapon, but also just in and of themselves, greater guidance system for missile technology is a potential problem for Israel and for the other Arab nations as it spreads through the region. I'm just remembering when Iran attacked those Saudi oil fields with missiles and with drone technology that seemed to, not elicit a response from the U.S. or from others. And so, in the time remaining, talk to us a little bit about the JCPOA and what you think would be an adequate response or next step for the United States and its allies with regard to containing Iran's nuclear and missile technology ambitions.
Again, we need to be able to distinguish between desirable goals and strategic reality. Arms control agreements in general have a very poor history, but we still want to have arms control agreements because it's better to have an arms control agreement than to have war. War is always dangerous. You don't want to engage in military action whenever possible because it is open ended. And if you could have a negotiated agreement, if you have a peaceful settlement, it is worth making the effort. So I certainly do not blame those who attempted to reach some agreement on arms control with Iran. Those motivations may have been noble indeed. But when you look at this agreement that was reached under the Obama administration, it is difficult to understand, it is difficult to see an agreement that would have been a larger failure and more inept than this particular agreement. It violates the most fundamental precepts of what an arms control agreement has to be. An arms control agreement has to involve something called scope, and it has to involve verification. If you don't have the right scope, it will fail. If you don't have proper verification, it will fail. If you have neither, it is diplomatic malpractice. Now, there are so many different features of every arms control agreement and codicils that people think it's very complex. So we should use a kind of Occam's razor to look at first principles. So let's look at scope. So when you talk about the nuclear capability, you do not look only at the bomb itself. You have to look at the delivery system. You have to look at command and control. You have to look at all those other things. You mentioned some of those. What was the scope of the joint comprehensive, how it was misnamed? Even look at the term, how it was designed to basically mislead.
Yeah, it was really just centrifuges and the materials that
It was
developed
not
the centrifuge.
comprehensive in the least. It did not cover missiles. It did not cover control, command, intelligence, C3Is. It left all of those things out. So Iran, even if everything was perfect, was allowed to move in developing all of the other elements. So even if you delayed the warhead, the capacity, by 10 years, provided a proper verification, they were free to create all those other mechanisms so it would be ready to go. And of course, this is what has happened. Iran has pursued all this technology. And this was demonstrated, as you mentioned, in the case of Saudi Arabia, where supposedly the Houthis fired these missiles, but it was Iranian missiles. And also they provided Hezbollah with a lot of missiles, especially the more sophisticated ones, because they were able to develop all those things and develop cyber capabilities and all the accompanying elements. And now let's look at the second one, verification. Verification should be anytime, anywhere, that is without notice. Do you have that built in? No. It is one of the worst failures. There are certain places where you cannot even go on military bases. You have to provide notification. So when you have international organizations like the IEA coming back and saying, well, really have found nothing that they're doing that is suspicious. Well, they have to give notification. They can't go anywhere. So where they were allowed to see, they saw nothing. But we know what keeps coming out is that they didn't see what they should have been seeing. So Iran has had the best possible deal. And when they were on the verge of economic collapse, they had an economic lifeline. They were able to reach that lifeline. So this was not a comprehensive deal. This was an incomprehensive deal.
Right. I like the language of diplomatic. What's the word? Now I'm blanking on it.
Diplomatic niceties?
No. Malpractice, diplomatic malpractice. But so I think you raise a lot of interesting points. Both the scope, the verification, and the release of billions of dollars of funding for Iran,
including almost $2 billion in cash.
Yeah, yeah. What I say to people is that if you want to understand why the Jews and why the Israelis are so concerned about Iran, you just have to understand that for the Jews, when somebody says they want to kill us, we tend to take them at their word, and when they start developing the means to do so, that's when we start getting really worried. And so I think that's what matters with Iran. And what I hear you saying is that for those of us that continue to be concerned about Iran and its existential threat against Israel, and its ability to disrupt and spread terrorism throughout the world, the lobbying efforts for the future should really be focused on scope and verification and containment.
And this is not merely a concern for Israel.
Right.
It's a concern for the Gulf states. It ought to be a concern ultimately for Europe as well, because in Iran you have a fanatical regime that seeks to destroy Israel first, but it has no great like
For anybody else.
or for Russia. And the Europeans operate on the basis that we are able to make profits, the Americans will take care of security. The Russians operate on the basis we don't want to send nuclear Iran either, but we're selling nuclear reactors. And at the last minute, we can just pull the plug, which is a very risky kind of policy. So in many ways, you have a kind of larcenous approach by the Europeans and the Russians, and you had a catastrophic kind of policy in the JCPOA by the Americans. You have a chaotic Middle East where Russia has reinserted itself. Iran has become more powerful. Turkey has new ambitions. So it is a very, very difficult situation in the Middle East. It really is worrisome. And anyone who cares really about stability and democracy, not just Israel, ought to be concerned.
Thank you, Aurel. Thank you, Dr. Braun. We should check back with you in 3 or 4 months because these issues are not going to go away quickly. In fact, as a new administration in the US comes in, they're probably going to heat up again. And I really appreciate the way in which you helped us to break down the issues and understand them in their component pieces. So thank you. We wish you, continued success and health and safety during this time of the pandemic. Dr. Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. We thank him for being with us today. Conversations over Coffee is going to take a couple of weeks off. Next week, Monday, is the official observance of Boxing Day, and then the week after that is New Year's Day weekend, so to speak. We're going to come back Monday, January 11th, where my guest will be Minister Marco Mendicino, who is the Minister of Immigration and Refugees. It's a very, very important conversation. Beth Tzedek is sponsoring another refugee family to Canada, a family that is an Eritrean family that is currently in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, where the fighting and the war is taking place. We're going to talk to the minister about Canada's policies for immigration and refugees, and specifically how those of us who care about this issue can participate in not only bringing the family that Beth Tzedek is sponsoring, but other needy individuals to Canada, both for safety as well as for adding to the quality of life and the capacity of Canada to be more competitive and compassionate in the world. So that's January 11th. We hope to see you then. Again, Dr. Braun, thank you for being with us. Thanks, everyone.